Welcome to Open Democracy's weekly live discussion. My name is Zeynep Sentek. I work on the Tracking the Backlash team as network coordinator. I'm joining you today from the capital of Turkey, Ankara. Welcome to everyone joining today, and we want this conversation to involve you as much as possible. Thank you all to who submitted questions and comments ahead of the time. We're going to address as many of them as we can. If you're joining us on Zoom, you have a question and comment for us, you can click on the chat icon at the bottom of your screen and type into the chat window. People watching on Facebook can put their questions in comments there, and my colleague will share them with me. This week's topic is how to end anti-gay conversion therapy around the world. Anti-gay conversion therapy, which is the attempt to change, suppress, or divert a person's sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression, has been condemned by medical and human rights groups around the world, but only a handful of countries have actually banned it. We will hear today some of the people who are very knowledgeable about the subject, who aren't waiting for national governments to take action. Instead, they're following the money behind conversion therapy, campaigning for local bans, and making churches more LGBT inclusive. Today, we have with us Khatondi, Soita, Wepukhulu, our East Africa Investigations Fellow on the Tracking the Backlash team at Open Democracy, who led on our recent conversion therapy investigation. We have Benjamin Cohen, the CEO of PinkNews in the UK. We have Neela Ghoshal, who is the Associate Director of LGBT Rights Program at Human Rights Watch. And last but not least, we have Reverend Michael Coren, who's an Anglican cleric and writer. So I'm going to ask each panelist a few questions each, and then I will come to the audience questions at the end. So please do put them in the chat box. So I will kick off with Khatondi. Khatondi, I would like to ask you, as a journalist, Open Democracy's Tracking the Backlash feminist investigative journalism team has just published a big investigation into conversion therapy across East Africa. Perhaps can you share some of what you found in this investigation?
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Zeynep. So my name is Khatondi. I'm based in Kampala. I'm very happy that we're having this conversation. I welcome my fellow panelists and everyone that's watching or listening in. Thank you for coming to this webinar. So over the past, over 6 months between December and May this year, Open Democracy carried out an investigation into so-called conversion therapy practices across East Africa, in Uganda, in Kenya, and in Tanzania. And we started out by interviewing 53 LGBT people, and we did this with the help of local researchers who are LGBTIQ themselves. They shared harrowing experiences that they've had with conversion therapy in their lives, and these experiences were across like different generations. Some were young, some were not. Some of these experiences had happened when they were minors, and some when they were adults or young adults. The experiences were varying in settings. Some were in family or religious settings, and some in medical settings, some in workplace settings. We decided to zero down on investigating to confirm conversion therapy experiences that they had shared with us in medical settings. And in total, we visited 15 clinics, and we ended up confirming conversion therapy being present, being offered in 12 of these. So out of 15, we confirmed them in 12 clinics. Out of the 12 clinics that we confirmed conversion therapy at, half of them were receiving money from international donor organizations or groups. So some of these groups, donor groups that, some of the clinics were funded by donor groups like the Global Fund, USAID program like PEPFAR, and some by MSI Reproductive Choices, which was formerly known as Marie Stopes. In Uganda, we visited seven public hospitals. In Uganda, undercover reporters were told that being gay is evil, or it's for white people, or it's a mental health problem. In Kenya, we visited clinics where undercover reporters were told that homosexuality is this thing that is being encouraged by popular or rich people, and that it could be changed if at all they could pay a certain fee, a small fee of about $14 or so. But remember, in countries like Uganda and Kenya and Tanzania, that's a lot of money for desperate family members who would like to see their children or their family members quitting homosexuality. In Tanzania, we visited a Maristop's clinic where our undercover reporter was told that there could be a timetable put up, and their gay brother could come in for sessions, and that you would find that they have changed. So in all the clinics that we visited, talk therapy was what was being offered. Although when we interviewed the 53 LGBT people, they shared that some had been put through electric shocks, some had been beaten, and some had been given medication. And truly in Uganda, our undercover reporter was actually told to give their gay brother a sleeping pill to prevent them from masturbating in the night. And then a psychologist also advised or recommended so-called exposure therapy. And in this case, the psychologist meant that a 17-year-old gay boy could be attracted to a housemaid, and that a family member could bring an attractive housemaid, a young one between 18 and 20, for a minor, a 17-year-old, according to Ugandan laws, to be attracted to. So those were some of our findings. And many times we were quite, of course, surprised to find that these clinics and health networks were funded by international groups. So those were some of our findings in summary. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Khatondi. Actually, thank you for your great work as well. I know personally that it took a lot of time and great to get the story. Next, I would like to ask Neela a question. Neela, you know about these bans, and some countries are now banning conversion therapy. But if these practices violate human rights and sometimes include coercion or misinformation, aren't they already illegal, or is the problem about laws or regulations or something else?
Thank you so much, Zeynep, and thank you, Khatondi, for discussing the expose that you did in East Africa. This is really powerful and impressive work. And I think that what Open Democracy is doing is leading the way to part of what we need to do to eradicate conversion therapy, which is demonstrate where it's happening and who's accountable for it. In this case, donors are directly involved in funding conversion therapy, and they're pretty easy target, right? Donors do not want to be funding conversion therapy, and so we need to expose that this is happening and get rid of it. But in most places and in most cases, it's not that straightforward. So as Khatondi has pointed out, in most of the examples that she documented, we're talking about talk therapy. And in much of the world, talk therapy isn't regulated in any particular way. And so therapists might be licensed by a board, might not in other countries, and effectively have a lot of power in their hands to influence their patients. Now, is there some degree of coercion? Is there some degree of misinformation in all of this? Certainly, but laws are not necessarily designed to eliminate that kind of coercion or misinformation that can take place in that kind of patient and medical professional setting. And so these are actually much more challenging things to think about in terms of how the law is designed to regulate that type of relationship. It gets even more complicated when we think about religious settings, because a lot of conversion therapy takes place in religious settings. The Open Democracy investigation focused on professional medical settings, but much of the conversion therapy that we've documented around the world, and I'm thinking about in places like Malaysia, Algeria, Latin America, as well as in places like Uganda, involves adults, or in some cases adolescents, who have absorbed a lifetime of harmful messages about their sexuality or their gender identity, who walk in to meet with a spiritual leader with some degree of consent. Now, consent is complicated, right? Because there's a power dynamic, and the person who seeks out this type of conversion therapy has been a victim of discrimination that has put them in a compromised position. And yet they walk in for an engagement with a spiritual leader who in some ways may take advantage of their vulnerability and the discrimination that has impacted their worldview and their sense of who or what they can be. And I raise this complexity not to say that we don't need to double down and focus on eradicating conversion therapy, but to say that we need to look very carefully in each country and in the international human rights framework at what the laws and protections allow us to do. And so, for instance, there are a number of advocates who are calling for criminalizing conversion therapy, even if somebody walks in and seeks out conversion therapy consensually. This is a really complicated question and might not be the most appropriate solution when in fact we could look at other ways to address the drivers of conversion therapy. Why is it happening in the first place? What led the people who are seeking out conversion therapy to seek it? And what kind of social and cultural factors led providers to be offering it? In many cases, governments are sort of jumping toward the idea of a ban, which is not necessarily problematic, but there needs to be carefully targeted to the setting, whether it's a pastoral setting, a professional therapeutic setting. But there's this, I'm a bit concerned about the sense that we can ban what is in many cases a type of conversation, and that we're not looking at how to influence what happens in schools, things like comprehensive sexuality education, whether children are enjoying access to that, to understand who they are, to develop their own identity, whether we're looking at wiping out bullying in schools, whether we have comprehensive non-discrimination laws that allow people to seek access to recourse for discrimination. And I'm putting all of these things on the table because I think they're all part of a bigger picture and that we need to be addressing all of them simultaneously, looking at laws, but also looking at other ways that we can address the root causes of conversion practices.
Thank you, Neela. You talked about religious settings, so my next question then would be actually in similar to that to Reverend Coren. Churches and religious groups around the world have been found to offer conversion therapy. I would like to ask how widespread is this within church communities?
Well, I would suggest it's the major driver, excuse me, now of conversion therapy. I mean, just a brief history. Look, there's an open debate going on, as I'm sure you all know. I can't speak with any particular knowledge about non-Christian religions. I know a little. But within Christianity, there is a great divide, of course, between, and these are ugly terms, but progressive Christians, conservative Christians, evangelical fundamentalist, Catholic and non-Catholic. I would say the general view is still homophobic in that there is a literal misunderstanding, a literal reading of just a handful of texts in Scripture. I mean, Jesus never talks about homosexuality. The Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures never refer to lesbianism. When St. Paul does write about this subject, you don't need to be a Greek expert. If you just understand the language he uses, he's quite clearly referring to straight men using boys in pagan initiation ceremonies. This is not about an adult consenting, loving relationship. When the Old Testament does talk about same-sex relationships, it's also paired with rather archaic, extremely anachronistic laws about mixing cloth and what to do with your children, slavery, genocide. I mean, you don't have to be a scholar to realize that contextualizing this is absolutely vital. There are 750,000 words, roughly, I haven't counted them all one by one, in the Old and New Testament, in the Bible, as we know it in the Western world. And probably about 400 of them refer in any way to this issue. I've sometimes thought that if a Martian landed and picked up the Bible, they would say, oh, that's the book all about homosexuality, isn't it? I mean, it's just simply not mentioned. And I don't want to get into a big discussion of this, but you may not be aware of it, but there's a beautiful part of the New Testament of the Gospels when Jesus is confronted with a Roman centurion who is in love with his slave, slave had a different meaning back then. Often if someone had been in the household with someone for 30 years, they were members of the family, and it wasn't race-based. But anyway, again, with the Greek that's used here, he says, I love this man. And it's not platonic love. It's not directly sexual, but it is, I think it is romantic. I love this man. Say the word and he'll be cured. And Jesus says, I wish my people could be as good as you, and you're just a pagan sin. Sure, he's cured. Now, the general view at that time by the occupied Jewish people, who tried to find any way to, get back at their occupiers, they say, oh, well, the Roman soldiers, they go back to their barracks and you know what they're up to. It was a way to criticize them, to belittle them. The general view was the Roman soldiers were accepting of homosexuality. There are many, many scholars who argue that story would have been considered to be about a same-sex partnership. And Jesus' response is to say, good on you. You're really impressive. Your love, your faith is extraordinary. Now, I'm not saying that's an absolute interpretation, but it's a very possible one. I don't want to take up too much time. The whole idea that homophobia should be fueled by Christian teaching is repugnant, it's grotesque, because it's simply not there. It really isn't. However, for the longest time, through most of history, in fact, Christianity has taught that homosexuality is sinful. Now, it's varied over the years. So now it's become not being gay, but that if you act on your homosexuality, that's a sin, which I've always thought to be disingenuous at best. It's fine to be straight, but if you actually get married, then you're sinning. It doesn't make, it's inconsistent. It was for the longest time just hatred. Get out of here. You're not welcome. You're a sinner. You're awful. We should hurt you. Christianity has evolved. Also, the times have evolved. So now it's a different response. And part of that is conversion therapy, which really does have its origins to a large extent within organized Christianity. I would say not all of it. Freud, most of us know about his teaching, and I think originally it was more Freudian. But in the past 30 or 40 years, many in the evangelical world and within conservative Catholicism have adopted conversion therapy or reparative therapy as what they think is a civilized way to deal with gay people. So we love you so much, we want you to change entirely, deny who you are. And the point that was made earlier by Neela, it's extremely pertinent. What is consent? I think it's pretty clear cut to say you cannot try and change a young person. This is unfair, this is cruel. In Canada, this legislation is passing through Parliament right now. But if an adult says, I want to speak to someone, I want to change, it becomes a rather nuanced situation in terms of the law. But the societal pressures, religious pressures, if you're part of a church where from the youngest age you have been told, even by ostensibly kind people, your feelings, your self-identity, the way you think is wrong, you can't just expunge that when you reach adulthood. It's very, very difficult. But it isn't, look, the conversion therapy, it's not just that we know how cruel it is. Scientifically, pragmatically, we know it's ridiculous. It's simply, it's not, it's what it's trying to do is replicate the idea that by strong and compelling and kind discussion of a faith, you can convert someone to another faith. This is why the word is used. So if I really present the Gospels in a loving, beautiful way, you might become a Christian. Terrific, great. We all believe you have a right to embrace another religion if you want to. But what it's saying is that someone can change their very being, their sexuality, which is intrinsic and integral to the human person, that can be changed by a form of conversion. And it's untrue and it's profoundly damaging because it leads to it leads to self-harm, suicide attempts and suicide and questions of self-worth. And a lot of the funding is coming from Christian groups, often through third parties. A lot of the impetus in Africa in particular, if you do dig away, and I'm sure some of you know more than this than I do, there are Christian groups behind it. In North America, I would say, I'm not even aware in North America of a non-Christian conversion therapy group. Now, I may be wrong, but I'm not aware of it.
But there are.
And I mean, one of the most high profile was a man called Joseph Nicolosi, who died, I think, last year or earlier this year. And that was, There's a very interesting interview where Stephen Fry speaks to him, and I urge people to go and watch it on YouTube. But it was pseudo-scientific, that people could be converted, could be changed. You're not going to change Christian teaching overnight. There is an enormous, the Methodist Church in Great Britain voted overwhelmingly to marry same-sex couples last week or 2 weeks ago. The Anglican Church of Canada, the American Episcopal Church, the Scottish Church, and much of Australia and New Zealand. Not everywhere. The Anglican Church in Africa has, in Uganda and elsewhere, has a very different attitude. The Church of England in England is divided on this issue. The Roman Catholic Church in North America, I've never taken a poll. How could I? It wouldn't surprise me if the majority of Roman Catholics in North America supported equal marriage. But the teaching isn't going to change for a long time, if ever, in spite of the fact that at least a third of Roman Catholic clergy are gay, many of them in relationships. The evangelical church, strangely enough, you might be surprised by this, I think that could change quicker than the Catholic Church. Because although it's very conservative at this point, it allows for individual interpretation of scripture. And there are some younger evangelicals, there are the stages. The first stage is homophobia. The second stage, don't talk about it because we're not sure. Third stage is acceptance. And you're seeing some of that happen. The Orthodox churches are in a different position because they've only recently come out from under the control of communism. But I would say give that a few years and you will see some progressive changes. But it's taking time. And a lot of writing is taking place in activism, but it's taking a long time. And the church has a lot to be responsible for. A lot of this pain, and I say this with great shame, comes from Christian sources.
Thank you, Reverend Coren. Thank you for your input. You talked about the Anglican Church, so I want to ask something more specific to you, Benjamin, about the situation in the UK, because conversion therapy is increasingly in the news in the UK. Could you tell us a bit more about how big the problem is in the country and how does it affect LGBT people's daily lives?
Sure, and thank you for having me on the panel. And I want to also pay tribute to all of the work that Open Democracy is doing. Some of the investigations that Khatondi and others have done is really important, particularly on the situation that's happening in Africa. I also just wanted to add something, and I'll talk about the UK, because Michael mentioned about Christian groups, and it's predominantly Christian groups in America, which it definitely is. But I know I'm Jewish, I know from my experience and from friends, gay people in America, more than in the UK, have gone on conversion therapy kind of camps, like Jewish camps. And there's a friend of mine who was brought up in the more orthodox towards Haredi movement, who was encouraged to go to a conversion therapy camp. And while there, he was sexually abused as part of bizarre, this is the problem, like treating their sexuality by raping them, which is the situation that unfortunately happened to him. And another friend didn't have quite as poor experience, but they were actually there at the same time. And the pleasant thing is that they're both proud gay guys in New York now, and one of them is married and very happy. And so we've seen that it is escapable, but then equally at the same camp, a British Jewish person took their own life. So it is the fact that this is happening beyond just the Christian faith, it is happening in other faiths too. And my sort of involvement in this area kind of stems from I went to a grammar school for beginning of secondary school, but for sixth form I went to a Jewish day school for a state-run Jewish school, and the school that I went to a few years after I left, in the sixth form, in the Jewish religious studies lesson, it was explained by a teacher that you could cure homosexuality, and indeed they were pointing to the very same programs that had led to people taking their own life and indeed being raped as well. With Keshet UK, which is the kind of Jewish LGBT forum in the UK, we mounted a kind of campaign to raise awareness of reparative therapy within the community, and also sort of highlight things like the It Gets Better campaign to kind of show that there were ways around this. If your parents and others were pressurizing you into this, that there are people around you that you can go to. So I just wanted to make it clear that it's definitely, but it's a numbers game, right? There are a lot more Christians than there are Jews in the world. So this is a much more significant issue from a volume perspective within the Christian faith, but it is happening in communities around the world. And I'm sure is happening in, within the Muslim community as well. In fact, someone I know, I'm not sure they went through an actual like a conversion therapy treatment, but unfortunately they took their own life when they felt that they couldn't resolve their faith with their sexual orientation. And that is unfortunately the situation for many LGBT people, particularly who've come from a faith background. And even myself, I'm not come from a particularly religious background, but I was relatively observant. The interesting thing about being on a Zoom with Michael is that I have a theology degree, so I'm really interested in theology myself. But when I was a teenager and first understanding my sexual orientation, I was wondering, was this a test from God? I'd seen the stuff, obviously I didn't study or believe in the things that are in the New Testament, but I'd seen Leviticus, which we read every year on Yom Kippur, those prohibitions, the supposed prohibitions on homosexuality. And from a very raw understanding, I understood, that it was perceived to be wrong to be gay, but also certainly at that point, had there been a cure more like a tablet or something, I can't imagine ending up in some of these therapies, but I would have taken that, because why would anyone want to be different? And at the time, if you think about the legislative process in the UK, LGBT people, gay people had very few rights. It was legal to be gay, but I was a teenager. The age of consent was 21 at the time, and you had basically no other rights. And in a lot of the countries which you've done reporting on, not only do you not have the legal protections that we enjoy in the UK, it's also illegal to be gay. So you can see why people would find themselves forced into that situation. But to come back to actually the question you asked me, I'm sorry for just giving a load of other thoughts, but the situation in the UK is complex. So PinkNews, which I'm the CEO of, has been pushing this issue for quite some time. So we have very regular kind of interview opportunities and Q&A sessions with the Prime Minister, whoever the Prime Minister is. And it's been a consistent question from readers. So for the 2010 general election, it was asked to the candidates. In the 2015 general election, it was asked to the candidates, to both the eventual Prime Minister, but also those running to be Prime Minister. It was asked in 2017 to Theresa May, and it was asked again to Boris Johnson, actually, the last general election in 2019. Has been over time a general sort of wording, which is, we need to stamp this out. We need to find out whether it's happening. And there was first the moves to kind of not allow referrals within the NHS, the National Health Service. So that was a first move. And actually a friend of mine, not Jewish, actually Christian, many, many, many years ago was referred via the NHS, via the National Health Service, to a conversion therapist in Wales. So this was a real issue within the National Health Service. Where we are now is quite complex, because you've got the Conservative current government saying that they wish to ban gay therapy, gay queer therapy, or as they would call it. And it's important they're talking about gay queer therapy, because there's issues related to transgender people, which I'll come on to. But the central issue that I have with how it can be achieved is very much linked to what Neela was saying before, because the problem is that it's talking therapy predominantly in the UK. So like my friends who had stuff in Wales 20 years ago, that was electric shock therapy and things like that, which I think thankfully is not the core type of therapies that are being used anymore, though there are, as ITV News in the UK showed, within particular churches in the UK, there are kind of exorcisms being carried out by pastors and things, but it's predominantly talking therapy, and talking therapy in the UK, like many other jurisdictions, is not regulated. So the challenge that there will be when this goes to the House of Commons, and there's a consultation going to be opening soon, is how does one regulate the talking therapy for conversion therapy, but not create a regulatory structure for every other type of talking therapy. Now, I am actually not opposed to there being a regulatory structure, but it is a bigger question, and actually, unfortunately, not really linked at all to the topic or LGBT conversion therapy. It's a fundamental, you can go to relationship counselors, you can have counseling for all sorts of things in the UK and many other countries. And the person who is giving that counseling may be a member of a professional body, but has no statutory regulation, in the same way that I don't know, a doctor like my husband, who's a general practitioner, is regulated by a statutory recognized regulator. And so there is a regulatory problem. The other thing is that the government in the framework for the consultation is looking at a number of things. One is the impact on religious conversion therapy. And my gut feeling is that when any legislation comes forward, there will be exclusions for religious, there will be enough exclusions for conversion therapy that happens within a religious setting and under religious freedom, that means that in reality, 99% of the conversion therapy that happens within the UK would be perfectly legal to continue, and that is a challenge. The second thing is that as a separate issue, as many people who are watching and participating in this will know, the UK is in the middle of a very complex and loud debate around trans rights. And the problem is that some people who advocate, some people who are gender critical or opposed to some of the progress on trans rights may advocate that that in itself is a form of conversion therapy. Listening to a young person, particularly, who's saying that they are gender non-conforming and they may wish to transition from their assigned gender to their true gender, and allowing them to do that is converting them, because there is an allegation that those people are really gay. And it's a ludicrous allegation, but that is literally part of the debate at the moment. So many of us who are watching this from the UK perspective are concerned that there will either be too many protections for this happening in religious institutions, that it's really hard to regulate it anyway, but also that there'll be other exemptions or wording in the legislation that may actually make it harder for trans people, particularly trans youth, to access the services that they desperately need to be able to access because of the way that the legislation might be framed.
Thank you, Benjamin. And I know, Reverend Coren, you need to leave. And because of that, I would like to ask you one last question, if that's okay. Sure. I'm curious what you think about LGBT inclusive churches. How are some churches working to become more inclusive? And where can pious LGBT people go for more information about these kind of inclusive churches?
Oh, there's a lot of information online. If you just Google the subject, there's something called the Reformation Project, but there's several others too. In Canada, it's interesting because in the Anglican Church in my diocese in Niagara, just outside of Toronto, you'd be really pushed to find a church that wasn't. I'm not sure if there are any actually. It's just, and Toronto, pretty much the same. It's very positive. The largest Protestant church in Canada, it's called the United Church. It was a formation of Presbyterians and Methodists and so on quite a few years ago. Once again, vast majority of churches completely inclusive. And I think you'll find this replicated in the UK. In the Church of England, there's a division. I mean, the Church of England, well, don't get me started, but again, a bit of a game is played. It's yes and it's no simultaneously, but you'd have to search around. Within the Roman Catholic Church, which is the largest Christian denomination, of course, no church is going to be completely affirming. There are different churches that will be more accepting and more open, and reading between the lines, you may conclude certain things. But the official teaching of the church is still quite draconian. And there's a handful of evangelical churches. I know of 2 Baptist churches. Because of their polity, Baptist churches are autonomous, really. So they can say to a large extent whatever they want. I know of 2 churches in Ontario, Baptist churches that will marry same-sex couples. They're the only two I know of. I can't imagine there are any other. There may be, but I'm not aware of them. So I would Google, and I'm sure various LGBTQ organizations, if you write to them, will have a list. It's not as difficult as you might think. Now, I can't speak about other continents. It's probably much more difficult to find. But I know it can, for those outside of the Christian world, it can seem a very bleak and dark place and that everyone is on the wrong side. But you might be surprised how much work is being done. I'm sure Bernie in the UK has had a lot of these contacts. There's a huge amount of work being done within the Christian world to try and change things. And generally, the direction is very positive. But I would say that there is a reaction. It fits into what you're doing at your organization. There is a backlash. And there are people who, within the Christian world, who are frightened by the progress being made. So they're lashing out. And they're becoming, if anything, more homophobic. And Pope Francis, who is very good on many issues, so economic justice and immigration and climate change, not on every issue. And he vacillates when it comes to affirming same-sex couples. And just recently, the church said it will not bless same-sex unions. This wasn't marrying gay couples. That's not even being considered. This was just blessing unions of two people of the same gender. They said no because they can't bless what is sinful. So it's just, I mean, I don't think it'll happen in my lifetime. It may happen eventually, but unless I live to be very, very old. So there's a lot of good, but there is pushback. And I'm not an expert on this, but in terms of what is happening in Africa, and this is really obscene, you find that there are American and some Canadian, but American and some British Christians with money who are trying to influence the situation. And they're exploiting in a very colonial way, actually, attitudes that are there. And we see it in the Caribbean as well. We have strong links as a Commonwealth country with parts of the Caribbean. And I mean, I know in Jamaica, it's been a combination of some local homophobia without any doubt, but also a great many American in particular evangelists who've gone out there to really push. And this is a country that had very few TV channels until fairly recently. So that people were enormous damage was done.
Thank you. Thank you, Reverend, for your input. Khatondi, I would like to get back to you and your investigation. And your investigation actually has had significant impact already. Can you tell us a bit more about the reactions from the aid donors and the NGOs that you were talking about, and how you think investigative journalism can maybe be part of the solution here?
Thank you, Zeynep, and thank you to Reverend Coren. So we've reached out to different donors, international donors that were funding the clinics that were implicated in our investigation, and we heard back from them, and many of them expressed shock and dismay at our findings, and many reiterated, like USAID reiterated, that they were not aware that the local NGOs that were receiving funding from them were actually offering conversion therapy or such DPS treatments at all. But it's not always that these are followed up by internal investigations. And we are happy to know, for example, that a clinic that we implicated in Kenya called LVCT Health, a very big local NGO that serves in different parts of Kenya, wrote back to us saying that they were ready to do an internal investigation, and we're yet to hear back what the results are. But it looks like our findings have been taken seriously, and donors are now trying to get in touch with local NGOs to see a way forward. But also formerly Marriage Stops International, which is now MSI Reproductive Choices, launched an investigation too in the clinic in Tanzania, in Mwenge, that we implicated in our investigation. And again, we're yet to hear the results of the investigation. They're all ongoing since our investigation just came out a few weeks ago. We are hopeful. The conversations are ongoing, and we hope to hear back from them. We have shared more information. We have been sharing audio tapes, transcripts, anything that international donors and implicated clinics would like to have their own internal investigations. As for how is investigative journalism a solution, I think our investigation is a typical example on what it can do to expose wrongdoing and harmful practices, which is very important. And that after exposure, then perhaps conversations can take place. It's not always that this is the solution, because journalists can only do so much. But first and foremost, information has to be out. People have to know what's going on. In this case, now we know that the local NGOs, big ones moreover, that are getting funding from international donors that are championing LGBT rights themselves around the world, that are offering conversion therapy. So now conversations are ongoing. We've had queer organizations like Gay and Lesbian Coalition Kenya calling for redirecting of funding from local NGOs to maybe LGBT organizations to do such work themselves to ensure that there is safety for queer people in this region. And so these are very important conversations to have, but first and foremost, investigative journalism made this exposure possible. So I think it's very, very important. It's very much part of the solution. It gets the conversation going.
Thank you, Khatondi. Thanks a lot. Neela, I would like to ask you about what's happening in the US and the bans. And I know that you are quite knowledgeable about what's happening. And as you know, many cities and states are not really waiting for a nationwide ban, and they're acting local ones now. Do you think this could be part of the solution, more local level laws? What do you think about it?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And first of all, I want to say that when we talk about what to do about conversion therapy or conversion practices, we do need to think about what kind of environment we're working in. In the places where Khatondi is working, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, for the most part, government is not going to be part of the solution, right? Donor governments might be part of the solution. The governments themselves, particularly in Uganda and Tanzania, will not be part of the solution. And so communities themselves are going to need to organize and create the change that they want to see. And I want to lift up the work of a couple of organizations that are doing really important work in that sense. In Kenya, for instance, we have Pema Kenya and we have Inand on the Kenyan coast that have done significant outreach to religious leaders, not around conversion practices per se, but just around recognizing the existence of LGBT people and recognizing that religious leaders have a role to play in fighting against violence and discrimination instead of propelling violence and discrimination. And so in places where you are not really close to getting the government fully on board with these issues, there's so much more that can be done. I think also of the work of LabMash in Lebanon, which is an organization that has been doing its own outreach to therapists, to medical practitioners, and engaging them and educating them on LGBT issues. And LabMash does things like provides awards to LGBT-friendly providers. And this is also in a country in which same-sex conduct is effectively criminalized. And so there's so much that can be done outside of waiting for governments and waiting for legal structures to take up these issues. In the US, it's of course a particular type of system in which many things are legislated on a state and local level. And there is a lot that I think local lawmakers can do. I do think that because we're talking about laws that have an impact on other exercise of other human rights, such as the right to freedom of speech and freedom of religion, local lawmakers, if they want to take up these issues, have to think really carefully about their constitutional obligations. And so, as I mentioned before, there's only so much you can do to regulate religious space constitutionally in the US with regard to the First Amendment and with regard to international human rights as well. But I think that there are some local lawmakers who are thinking really strategically about how to put in place targeted bans that can be effective. And for instance, recently, there's been a case in North Dakota. This is a very conservative state, for those who don't know the US, very Republican dominated. But in North Dakota, a law was put in place that prohibited social workers from conducting conversion practices. And it was not universally accepted. There were some people among the North Dakota lawmakers who thought that conversion practices were perfectly acceptable, but there was enough of an argument that this was harming the clients of social workers, particularly children. And social workers are licensed in North Dakota, and so therefore, under this law, they can lose their license if they conduct conversion practices. And this is a really important example, I think. In the state of Florida, we had what was also an effective and targeted law, which unfortunately was invalidated by a US federal court. And this was a law that prohibited therapists from conducting conversion practices on children. So again, very limited. Children have a particular need and right to be protected from conversion practices. They don't have the same ability to consent as when they walk into a therapeutic space. And therapists are regulated in Florida and are supposed to be providing therapy in line with medical evidence-based standards. And yet a US federal court said that this law was unconstitutional and violated therapists' First Amendment rights. And so that was, in my view, a very problematic decision, because that's exactly the type of local initiative that we would want to be encouraging. And so, yes, definitely take this up at the local level, but also let's take this up at the community level as LGBT communities. How can we push to create space for LGBT people, particularly youth, to be themselves? If we can get our governments on board in affirming that they have a responsibility to create that space, we should do so. And in places where we can't yet, create that space ourselves.
Thank you so much, Neela. Benjamin, I would like to ask the last question to you, and I would really appreciate if it's brief so that I can take a few audience questions as well. So do you think the discussion in the UK has been dragging on, and is more debate actually needed, and how would you like to see the UK debate on these issues evolve eventually?
But the debate has certainly been dragging on, because it's been discussed for nearly, 12, 13 years, probably. There's been lots of discussion about it. I mean, Theresa May was very clear that she felt it should be stamped out, responding to the investigation that ITV News did into the church run conversion therapy activity in the UK. I can't exactly predict what's going to happen, but I have to say that I'm relatively pessimistic about whatever legislative approach that's made actually achieving very much, because there's lots of like challenging things here. As Neela says, there's lots of free speech issues, so people can make free speech defenses. The right of free speech is not as is not the same as in the United States, but there are the faith is a protected characteristic under the 2010 Equality Act in the UK. So if you are, and the problem is that sexual orientation, being gender reassignment is protected characteristic as well in the legislation. It doesn't use the term gender identity, but that's how many people interpret it. So you've got a number of conflicting things. In the Jewish situation, that's recognized not just as a faith, but also as an ethnic group. And that will be the case in certain other, for certain other denominations as well. So you've got the rights are conflicting with one another. And as I've seen in the Jewish situation in the UK, the conversion therapy isn't happening here, but is being sort of referred. The internet's very big. You can find out what's going on in other countries. And if a parent or a teacher or whoever, a rabbi, whoever wants to refer someone to somewhere else, they can go and do it in the United States or in another country. So even if you outlaw it in one country, if you manage to resolve all of the challenges of regulation and the rights of people to say what they want and the rights of religions, that even if you do manage to do that, you've got a separate situation with, well, what are you restricting people's freedom to travel to another country if they are themselves, as was said on the conversation earlier, sort of consenting, but consenting because of their religious background and the way they've been brought up in the family structure. So my honest answer is that I am very supportive of there being activity to do this, but I am concerned that it won't actually be able to eradicate it without it being across a number of different jurisdictions and essentially being quite universal. And the problem is it probably isn't. So just like Michael was saying that he doesn't think the Christian church is like the Anglican church and others are going to accept everything in his lifetime, I'm not 100% on this, because I think there's too many loopholes that will exist. What we can do is create environments. I think it was Neela that said this about inclusive sexual relationship education, and think about creating environments that would at least make it very much less likely for a young person to consent to such services or such processes, through progresses in other forms of legislation, whether that would be things like marriage, things like Gender Recognition Act reform, and things like that, that affirm people's position and who they are, and then celebrate their identity. That may reduce to an extent some of the demand and some of the willingness of some people to go through with this. But the unfortunate situation is that for thousands of years, people have been following different faiths, and in theory, the prohibition on homosexuality is, if you truly believe things, is like multiple thousands of years old. It's in the Torah. It was dictated by God to Moses on top of Mount Sinai. Therefore, it's codified there, and it's in other documents. So later documents do. Rashi describes prohibitions on lesbianism, although it's certainly not in the Torah. So it's neither in the Old Testament or the New Testament, but in further literature it is. So I'm just basically saying that it is complex. This has been going on for a long time. In my view, it's great to try and do this, but be aware that you're not going to fix it unless there's international cooperation on this. And secondly, unless you've got the other things right. So allowing people to celebrate who they are and their identities, and them feeling welcome and accepted in the communities that they live in. Then the any consent that someone might give to this will go away.
Thank you, Benjamin. So I will take one question that the audience asked, and then afterwards we can wrap up. And the question is about the colonial laws, and I think, Khatondi, maybe this question is for you, because I know that you're quite knowledgeable about it and did a lot of research while you were working on the investigation. The question came from Zeynep Maria. She asked, where can people find information on the history of anti-LGBT imperial laws, and will this be taught in mainstream education?
Thank you, Zeynep. Sorry, I hope I get that right. Anti-LGBT laws that come from our colonial period. I think we've covered some articles on that. Recently, we put out an article on the sexual offences bill that Uganda's parliament passed, and it was recriminalizing the LGBT people through criminalizing anal sex and sexual acts between people of the same gender. I think you could look out for that. It has some information on the history of anti-LGBT laws in Uganda, but also I think many writers have covered this. If you Google, you can find most of this information, but you will also see that there is not just one law from the colonial period. Parliaments and lawmakers keep on building on that same law and not changing it or making it more specific to target LGBT people. In Kenya and in Tanzania, for example, existing laws say they criminalize anal sex, and this is not just this is not targeting straight people who have anal sex. It is targeting gay men. So some laws are very specific and some are not, but they're still in existence because of all the three countries have existing penal codes from the colonial period, but they also have laws that have been passed of recent that you can look up and see. So you can easily see how much of the colonial laws are influencing even new laws in 2021. Yeah, and also the psychologists and the counselors that we visited, many of them are coming from, this is a criminal thing to be LGBT is illegal, it's criminal, to have this kind of sex is criminal or it's illegal. So a lot of these laws actually do support what counselors and psychologists were doing, offering conversion therapy treatment, and also they feed into these myths about homosexuality, that it can be changed, or that it's a sin, or that somehow it's not acceptable. So laws, existing laws, even colonial ones, remnants of colonial laws like the Penal Code, feed into societal perspective on homosexuality and same-sex relations, as we saw with the counselors and the psychologists that we visited. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Khatondi. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Neela. We do have to wrap up now. Thank you so much for everyone for joining us in this debate, all the panelists and the audience. We have these weekly discussions every week. You can check our website and social media to see more details. And you can go to opendemocracy.net/tracking the backlash if you're interested in more feminist investigative journalism. My colleague will put some links in the chat to our Open Democracy newsletter. Finally, Open Democracy relies on contributions and donations. So if you want to see more public interest journalism like this, please support us and Open Democracy. And thank you all again, and see you next week in the next live discussion.
Thank you for staging this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.